We know the Lord. He's saved us. 10 o'clock every night, I call it my finish line, where I get to go to my study and just read whatever I want for me. And I read a statement last week and I texted it to the pastor, and it kind of applies to today. Listen to these words. I don't know who wrote them. I have served the Lord so long that I can hardly tell the difference between a blessing and a trial. Did you hear that? I have served the Lord so long that I can hardly tell the difference between a blessing and a trial. Isn't that the truth? Sometimes a trial comes to us, and we see it as a trial, and we call it a trial, but it ends up to be a blessing. Amen. Now, my father had a favorite author. His name was A.W. Tozer. And some of our guys are reading Tozer these days. I think Andy Burns is, and of course Ed, right down here in the front row. And A.W. Tozer said something that introduces our message today, and I want you to hear it. A.W. Tozer said this: I doubt that there is a man or woman whom God has used greatly, but what he has not first hurt deeply. I doubt that there is a man or a woman whom God has used greatly, but what he has not first hurt deeply. That is never more true than it is this morning for our man Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17. You have some scripture in front of you. You have an outline. Some people like to use that. And if you would rather take it home and wrap fish in it, that's okay. I don't care what you do with it, but the scripture is there. God wished to use him in a great way, and therefore he hurt him in a deep way. If you look down at verse 2, you will see a strange name and a strange location. Verse 2 says, Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, Leave here and turn eastward and hide by the Kerith ravine, east of Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered ravens to feed you there. Now the name of the brook is Kerith, Kerith. I have heard of that brook all my life, the place where God told his man Elijah to hide out. But I never wondered what that word meant. And so I was surprised to discover that that word Kerith comes from the Hebrew tongue, and it's a word that means to cut off, or to cut away and tear away and whittle away at an individual or a thing. Now that's what happened to Elijah there beside the brook. And that's what's happening to some of you here this morning. You are being cut down. Oh, not cut off from God's love, but cut off from an enjoyment, an involvement that you used to know and had for most of your life. But your circumstances have changed, and you are now by the brook like Elijah, and it's a humbling experience. But God isn't through with Elijah. No way. God's plans for Elijah was more than a dried up brook at Kerith. And he has more, yes, for you and me. That's why I love the verse Philippians 1:6. He that hath begun a good work in you shall complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Now, verse 8 of 1 Kings 17 says this: the word of the Lord came to him and said, go to Zarephath. Now, if Kerith means to cut or to cut off or to whittle away or cut down, maybe you're wondering what Zarephath means. I'm glad you asked. I was glad and disturbed at the same time to discover that the word means to smelt or to melt. It's the word for a furnace or a crucible or a kiln. And there was apparently a smelting plant of some kind there at Zarephath. And that is the place that God had designed for Elijah. In other words, I have taken you, Elijah, to Kerith to be cut up, to be cut down, to be probed, to be pushed, to be penetrated. But now, Elijah, I plan to melt you. That was God's plan. Now that brings me to say this. Some of you here today have walked with the Lord long enough to know that His tests come back to back. In fact, some of you would correct me to say, Bob, for me it's more like back to back to back to back. They don't stop with one or two. They multiply, they continue, they proliferate. That's the way it is in my life. As soon as I think, yes, I've got that one solved, the flame gets hotter, and I'm in the furnace again. I'm in the kiln once again. I think that's precisely what the hymn writer had in mind to try to encourage us when he said, the flames shall not hurt thee, I only design thy dross to consume, thy gold to refine. How firm a foundation. You see, that's what the crucible does. That's what the furnace does. It brings to the surface the slag and pushes it aside so that the pure, beautiful treasure can emerge. Look at the word up here. The word is reflection. Look at that. I learned something new this week. I don't know who said it, but someone wrote, when the refiner is melting down the silver, he keeps the fire hot. In fact, he doesn't reduce the flame until he sees his own reflection in the silver. And when, and only when, he can see his reflection, does he know that the silver is refined. Is Jesus' reflection seen in your life today in the midst of your trial? You see, this was all a purpose of God to bring Elijah to Zarephath. He'd already tested him by the dried up brook at Kerith, but now the testing came at Zarephath. I don't like this sermon so far. Do you like the sermon? I don't like the sermon so far. But first of all, we need to notice on my sheet under Roman numeral 1, God knew where he was. God knew where he was. Look at verse 8. The word of the Lord came to him. He knew where he was. Never forget it. Sometimes it's easy to forget it. When you're in the fire, when you're in the furnace, it's easy to forget that he knows where you are. When I find myself in the furnace, there are 3 go-to verses that I have in my life. I'd like to share them with you. I use them often. They are my go-to verses. The first one is Isaiah 37 verses 4 and 5. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. Wow. Commit your way to the Lord, and he will bring it to pass. And then I go to Isaiah 41, verse 10. Fear not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. Be not dismayed. I will withhold you with my righteous right hand. And then my favorite is Isaiah 49, verse 16. Behold, I have written thy name on the palms of my hand. On the palms of my hand. How many times a day do you see the palms of your hand? I did something interesting this morning. I took a pen and I wrote on each palm the name of my wife, Sherry, Cheri, Cheri, and I wanted to see how many times between when I wrote that and to where I am today that I might have noticed her name on the palms of my hands. While I'm getting dressed, while I'm driving the car, how many times does God see your name in the palms of his hands? Folks, these are great verses that tell you that God knows where you are and he cares. But the second thing I notice, God knows where you're going. He not only knows where you are, but he knows where you're going. Please look at verse 9 and see two commands of this God who knew where he was going. God said, verse 9, go. Read the rest of the verse. The rest of the verse says, and stay there. Go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and stay there. Well, okay, go. That's not hard to do. That's not difficult. He'd be happy to leave that old brook. Go, that's easy. A change of situation would be delightful. But stay there. That's where the rub comes. Some of us here today are willing to go through a time of transitional testing. We can stand an hour or two. Some of you who are stronger can stand a day or two, maybe even a month or two, but no one wants to stay there. But God didn't tell him anything further than go and stay. But here's a problem, because wicked Queen Jezebel and her equally wicked husband, King Ahab, were after him. He was on their hit list. His picture, so to speak, was in every post office. And for God to tell Elijah to go away from the hidden place, Kerith, where he would be safe, and go to a city or a town where he might be noticed, well, that's a tough thing to do. But I read a verse last week that says, he knows the way I take. He knows the way I take. I don't know the way I take, but he knows the way I take. And so therefore, will you look at verse 9, and you will see a rather humbling piece of instruction. God said, I have commanded a widow to supply you with food. Oh my. Oh my. You see, Elijah wouldn't have minded it so much if God said, I have commanded you to go to a widow and take care of her and give her food. But no, he said, you are to go and a widow will take care of you. He was a man who stood before kings and queens. But God knew best, and he prepared this widow for his coming. So I've written down a little lesson that I can learn today, and this is what I put down on my sheet. I said, sometimes the most humbling tasks prepare us for the higher tasks. I sure hope that's true. How many of you are familiar with the name General Booth of the Salvation Army? General Booth was the one who said, I wish I could send all of my recruits to hell for 30 minutes. They would come back and win the world for Jesus. One day, General Booth was enlisting someone who came from a very wealthy background, and he wanted to test him a little bit, and he said, your first assignment is to blacken the boots of everyone in your company. And this young man's response was, fortunately, he said, if Jesus Christ could walk Calvary's Mount and die for me, then I can blacken the boots of the men in my company. A very humbling task. When I met Sherry in Houston, Texas, a number of years ago, Sherry had a great job with Hershey Chocolate. She had major accounts in Walmart and Kroger, and they gave her a generous expense account and a brand new car every year. And when I met Sherry, I was teaching in a small Christian school and making $200 a week. So on Saturdays, I thought, well, maybe I can hustle up some money here. And in Houston, it was kind of a thing where people liked their house numbers painted on their curbs so that emergency vehicles could find them and so forth. So on Saturday, I'd have to go to about 15 homes, knock on their doors before someone would say, yes, you can paint my curb number for $10. That's your price. So it was a long day, but sometimes you could make $100, $150, $200 on a Saturday. So I would go down there, clean off a little spot on the curb with a wire brush, paint a little rectangular white area, put my stencil together, 2380 or whatever it was, spray it, and then I had some little glass beads that I would throw against the wet paint so it would reflect at night. Some of my friends came by one day. They saw me on my knees at the curb. They said, there you are, Butler, on your knees at the curb. I said, I know I'm at the curb, but you know, I'm praying for these people in this house while I'm painting the numbers, and when they come out, maybe I'll be able to talk to them about Jesus. I don't know. But sometimes the most humbling tasks prepare us for the higher tasks. Elijah, I have planned a widow to take care of you. That's a humbling experience. Now, I don't know what God has for some of us, but in the process of the furnace, there may be some humbling experiences. They're necessary. They're part of the plan. So let's see if he's obedient. Elijah's obedience. Verse 11 says, so he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, God said, wait a minute now. There's two tests here in my school program for you. These courses are not electives. They're required courses. And the first one I'm calling the test of first impression. I wrote that on my notes here. The test of first impression. That's a big test. Verse 10, he came to the town gate, and a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, could you bring me a jar of water? I need a drink. He had left Kerith and the dried up brook. He probably might have been able to catch a drink of water between Kerith and the place God told him to go, but perhaps not. So he needed a drink. And verse 11 says, while she was going to get it, he called to her and said, and bring me a piece of bread. I think that really torqued her off, because in verse 12, she said, as the Lord your God knows, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug, and I'm gathering a few sticks to take home to make a meal for myself and my son that we might die. Wow. Welcome to Zarephath, Starvation City. You know, you don't have to do much living to realize the problem of first impressions. Have you ever made plans to move to another state or another city, or maybe plans to go to a new church, or taking on a new situation, and suddenly it's different than you planned? You had it all arranged in your mind that it would be one way, and it was not that way at all. It was another way, and it was worse than you had planned. That's why I'm saying it's the first impression blues. They set in. Every family that has ever moved has the first impression blues. And Elijah hiked from Kerith to Zarephath, planning for something more, and he got something less. Not only was water scarce, but there was no food. So Elijah came to Zarephath, and there was nothing except a woman looking for sticks that she could build a fire and fix a meal and die of starvation. Which brings me to the second test, the test of physical impossibilities. Physical impossibilities. You see, the woman had her eyes on the empty jar and the empty jug, right? And verse 12, she says, in the jar there's a handful of flour, and in the jug there's a little oil, and behold, I'm gathering sticks, and that's it. Lights out. We're going to die. Physical impossibility. But what did Elijah do? I am so impressed with what Elijah did. He wasn't going to let a little initial times upset him or impressions. He rolled up the sleeves of his garment, and he said in verse 13, don't be afraid. Go and make me a meal, and I promise you, God's going to have enough for you. I promise you, trust God. He'll have enough for you. Just take care of me first. Now, wait a minute. How could Elijah talk like that? How could he have such confidence in God? Well, because he had proven God faithful in Kerith. That's where he was. And so I wrote a lesson for myself, and it's this. You can't encourage others to believe the impossible if you haven't believed the impossible. Another way to say that is, you can't talk where you haven't walked.
Amen.
But you see, Elijah had walked 100 miles through a miracle, so that when he saw that empty jug and that empty jar, he said, why, shoot, that's no problem. That's no problem for God. He said, dear woman, get in there and fix those biscuits and have them ready and make them piping hot, and I'll guarantee you, here's the guarantee, verse 14, that the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run out until the day the Lord gives rain on the land. Wow, what a promise. That woman looked at Elijah, that stranger who came to their house with all of the dust and the dirt of the journey, and she heard words like she never heard before. Tell me, have you ever been around a person of faith? Have you ever rubbed shoulders with someone who didn't have in their vocabulary the word impossible? Why, it's contagious. It's inspiring. So look at verse 15. She went and she did. That's obedience. That spells it's possible. Look at verse 15. So she went and did as Elijah told her. What was the result? Verse 15. There was food for every day, and Elijah and the woman and her family. Why? Because the jar of flour was not used up and the jug of oil did not run dry. The God of great surprises. Oh, it must have been exciting. Now, they didn't have a variety in their meals. It was biscuits and water for breakfast and water and biscuits for dinner. But they had enough to eat. And what a thrilling thing it must have been for that woman and her son with that stranger to sit down at a table and look at a miracle and eat it. Some of you husbands and wives have had miracle meals. And can you imagine the time spent in prayer before that meal as they prayed? Dear Jehovah Jireh, dear El Shaddai, dear miracle worker. And what it must have been like to hear Elijah pray. It was like touching the throne to hear him pray. And by, I'm convinced that woman began to get the idea herself that God was providing. I imagine in my mind one morning Elijah getting up and he hears her singing in the kitchen. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Well, why not? Or maybe something from Lamentations. Great is thy faithfulness. Because she looked in the jar and found flour. And she looked in the jug and found oil. And the day before there was nothing. Now that doesn't mean they had everything they needed. But they had everything that God wanted them to find a need for. So I've written down a lesson for myself. It's this. When you don't get what you want, but God gives you what you need, that is the height of happiness. Or put that another way, when God says no to your wants and yes to your needs, you are happy. Now, as I close in the next 4 minutes, I've written down 4 lessons for me, and I'd like to share them with you. Number 1, God's leading is often surprising. Don't analyze it. Don't analyze it. When God leads you to a place like Zarephath, don't try to make sense out of it. Just go. Or if he leads you to stay in a certain situation and it's very difficult, but you have peace in your heart that you are to stay, don't analyze it. Just stay. The longer I live, the more I believe that God's leading is most often illogical. Illogical. A year ago, Sherry and I moved here with no jobs, no house, and no church family. But we have it all. We have it all. God's leading is often surprising. Don't analyze it. Secondly, the beginning days are often the hardest days. Don't quit. The beginning days are often the hardest days. Don't quit. The beginning days of a new job. The beginning days of a new semester. The beginning days of a new marriage. Others of you have come to a new beginning in the sense that something difficult has arisen in your home, and it's so difficult that you think it'll never improve. The beginning days are often the hardest. Don't quit. Third, God's promises, don't miss this, often hinge on obedience. Don't ignore your part. God's promises often hinge on obedience. Don't ignore your part. Elijah, arise and go. He arose and went. Woman, get in there and fix that meal. She went and fixed the meal. God's promises often hinge on obedience. Don't forget your part. Your part in coming to church. Your part in giving the tithe. Your part in supporting our Pastor Baker, who is putting body, soul, and spirit into what's going to happen next Sunday. Don't forget our part to pray for this day, to prepare for this day. And the pastor said to even fast for this day. God's promises often hinge on obedience. Don't forget your part. And finally, God's provisions are often just enough. Don't fail to thank Him. Don't fail to thank Him. Maybe you don't have the job you want. Maybe you don't have the position you desired. Maybe your marriage partner is not the person you dreamed of. But His provisions are just enough. Don't fail to thank Him. Now, I have one more thing to say. And I want you to hear this well. It was A.T. Pierson. He was a missionary. He wrote 13,000 sermons and 50 books. He wrote these words: being determined to perfect His saints, you and me. Being determined to perfect His saints, you and me, God puts His precious metal, you and me, into His crucible, the furnace, the kiln. And then He sits by it and watches it. Love is His thermostat, and love marks the exact degree of heat. Not one moment of unnecessary pain will He permit. And as soon as He sees the dross released so that He can see Himself in the fire, the furnace ceases. I love that. As soon as the Lord Jesus sees His image in me, in you, the furnace ceases and becomes cool. And then you know what? Now we're ready for the next tests that God brings our way. Sandy, the mountains. He has a purpose. I'd like us to stand because I have a prayer. I usually don't write out my prayers.